Friends, I invite you to take a deep breath. Imagine that what is above you is a starlit night, that all is calm, that all is bright.
Season of waiting by lighting this first candle, anticipating the light of the star that shone over Bethlehem for all to see.
Advent God, we open ourselves to hear your call today, to become those who not only wait, but also work for peace in our lives, our families, our communities, and our world. Amen.
Today's scripture from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 23. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child, to destroy him." Then Joseph got up. He took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. Here ends the reading of words that give us insight on God, and may God grant to us wisdom and courage for our interpretation.
So this has been an interesting week around here. There's been a lot going on. There's been the usual seasonal activities. There have been all kinds of people around the sanctuary this week making it look so beautiful. There's been, of course, all of the wonderful volunteers making the women's tea happen, which was a phenomenal event yesterday, I heard. And there was the 800 people who are always on our campus every week because there are so many groups that meet here. There was the buzz of activity trying to get the annual reports done for this meeting after worship today. And there have been concerts here as well. There was a concert here last night and the place was packed. So there's been a lot of activity around here, but that's not why this has been an interesting week. It's been an interesting week because of what's been going on at the border. As you probably know, there's been this migrant caravan that has been coming up from Central America, making its way towards the United States. Now that, in and of itself, actually isn't all that unusual. That actually happens quite a bit. And then last Sunday, after we gathered for worship, some of those migrants were met with tear gas, including children. That too, actually, isn't all that unusual. Did you know tear gas has been used since the Carter administration at the border? But images were captured of mothers with children in their arms running away from this tear gas. And it just hit people. The images were visceral. I think because it speaks to what has been going on in our world. You know, the Southern Poverty Law Center found that in 2017, there was a 22% increase in hate groups in the United States. They found that there had been a 13% increase in hate crimes. Unless you think we are immune to this in Southern California is a hotbed for hate groups. And you don't have to be a statistician to recognize that the dialogue, the rhetoric in our country has changed dramatically over the past few years. I mean, our current president, when he was on the campaign trail, called Mexican immigrants rapists. Oh, some of them, I'm sure, are good people. But he called them rapists. Things are coming to a head. And the country and the world are looking to San Diego, California, to see how we are going to respond. Now, lest you think this is just Caleb up on his political soapbox, I decided to pick an odd reading for the first Sunday in Advent. I mean, Jesus hadn't even been born yet, and here we've got him fleeing with his family to Egypt. But you know what Advent means? It means arrival. And we wait for the arrival of the Christ child. And I thought it was important at the beginning of Advent to know who it was that we are waiting to arrive. The child who is going to go with his family to Egypt to escape violent persecution. This is the child that we're waiting for. You know this story, don't you? The Magi, astrologers in the East, wise men as they're traditionally known, they see a star, a celestial phenomenon, and they travel, they follow it, all the way to Judea. And there they go and they meet the ruler who's in power, King Herod. That's what you did. Dignitaries go and they meet the ruler. And they extended greetings, but they didn't have a message that he particularly wanted to hear, because the message they brought was, hey, there's going to be a new king. Let's rejoice. He pretended to be okay with that and said, well, why don't you go ahead on your journey, but stop back by here, because I want to make sure that I can pay him homage too. And so the Magi continue on their way. They follow the star to a house in Bethlehem. And notice that here there is no stable, there is no manger in Matthew, it is a house. And they bring their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and then they are warned in a dream to go back by another route. So instead of going to Herod, they go back home a different way. And then Joseph, Jesus' father, he's warned that they should get up and go to Egypt. And it's a good thing that they do, because whenever Herod figures out that he's been double-crossed by the Magi, he sends out his soldiers to kill all the children 2 years of age and under. So you realize what happens here, right? The Holy Family flees the violence in their home country and seeks asylum in Egypt. Thank God the Egyptian border control wasn't there to meet them with tear gas. See, you understand as Christians what this means. It means that as Christians, we have an obligation to be involved in what's happening at the border, because we know that it's not just migrants who are coming to the border, it is Christ himself. For Jesus says, just as you do it to one of the least of these, including welcoming the stranger, you do it to me. This is especially true since part of the reason that these folks are having to flee their home country, especially folks in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, part of the reason that they have to flee their home countries is because of what the United States has done there. People don't want to just up and leave their homes. There's a professor at the University of Arizona who has said that one of the main reasons for this violence right now is because in the 1980s, the United States either directly funded or turned a blind eye to violence in these Central American countries. But she said what's particularly reprehensible is what the United States did in Guatemala in the 1950s. You see, in Guatemala, they had a democratically elected government. And the government decided that they wanted to give some of the land back to the indigenous peoples. But that would have impacted U.S. foreign interests. And so the United States government funded a military coup to overthrow the Guatemalan government. Unless you think I'm making this up, this is in a CIA report that has been declassified. You can read it for yourself. That led to a 36-year civil war in Guatemala. A 36-year war from 1960 to 1996. And during that time, around 200,000 people were killed. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, and many people were simply disappeared. Either for something they said, something they did, or because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, I was in Guatemala just over a decade ago. I spent a summer there, which I've told you about before. Officially, I was there studying Spanish. I was in the Spanish immersion program. But I was also learning about the Guatemalan culture. And before I left, my professor handed me a book by Rigoberta Menchú and said, read this before you go. And then I spent a lot of time learning about what had happened in Guatemala. And let me tell you, the fear and the mourning and the anger at the United States was still very palpable. I spent a lot of time at this place called Entre Mundos, Between Worlds. And I remember one evening they had people speaking about the Civil War and about the people that they had lost and about the people, the family members, the brothers, the sisters, aunts, uncles, parents, and children who simply vanished and they had no idea what had happened to them. On another evening, they had a man come and talk about what it was like to make the trek from Guatemala across Mexico to the U.S. border. As I recall, he was a journalist who was interested in this and decided to go on the trek himself to see what it was like. And he talked about how grueling and horrible it was to walk that distance, to be shoved, piled into these vans, to have to try and keep quiet in the hopes that corrupt police officers in Mexico wouldn't find you and sell you to the cartel, or that the cartel wouldn't find you themselves and kill you or sell you. And he talked about the coyotes that parents would hire to take their children up with the hope of crossing the U.S. border. And if you don't think that's a problem, in 2018 alone, there have been 50,000 unaccompanied minors who have crossed the border. That night, I wondered how any loving parent could send their children with a coyote, someone they had never met, across the border. But I was spending this time in a rural village called Chiquilaja, Guatemala. It's right outside of Guatemala's second largest city, Quetzaltenango. And in this rural village, people were poor. According to the World Bank, about 60% of people in Guatemala live below the poverty line. About 23% live below the line of extreme poverty, which is less than $1.90 a day. If you're indigenous, in Guatemala there are a number of indigenous groups, but if you're indigenous, that rate's much higher. That shouldn't be a surprise to us. 80% of indigenous folks in Guatemala are living in poverty, and about 40 live in extreme poverty. And these folks in Chiquilaha, they were indigenous, and they were living in extreme poverty. They had large families. You could tell it in the school. It was a 2-room schoolhouse with rusted metal and old plywood, had torn plastic sheets for windows, it had dirt floors and no running water for bathrooms. But you might not know it by looking at the kids. The kids were filled with joy. They'd run around. It looked a lot like our preschool, actually. The kids running around everywhere. You wouldn't know that they didn't know where their next meal was coming from. They simply had never known anything different. And I've probably told you about my last day in Guatemala when a boy named Pedro took me by the hand and walked me across the dirt road, dug around in his pocket and pulled out a coin, a quetzal, and bought me a popsicle. Gave everything he had to a foreigner who by all rights he should have hated, because I was from a country who did horrible things to his. And I began to realize that if I were in that situation, I would probably do absolutely anything that I could to make sure that I knew that my child had something to eat for the next meal and was going to be able to make it through the next day safe. You see, what's going on right now is that Pedro, my friend, is at the border. Oh, maybe not that exact child, but there are children, there are families who have had experiences just like that and worse. And more to the point for us as Christians, it's not just Pedro at the border, it is Christ. Our country, our world are looking right here at San Diego to determine how they are going to respond and to see if we are going to respond. And more specifically, organizations that have been coming into San Diego have been looking to University Christian Church to see if we are going to respond. Why? Because we have proclaimed boldly that we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of each and every person, and they're coming to see if we really mean it. You know, I've often wondered, if I was a white pastor living in Montgomery, Alabama in 1956, if I would have been out participating in the Montgomery bus boycott, or if I would have stayed comfortably in my pulpit. And now's the time to decide. Not just for me, but it's the time for this congregation to decide what kind of a congregation we're really going to be. Now, I don't know exactly what we're going to be asked to do, or what exactly we're going to be able to do. I know that on Wednesday of this week, I'm going down with other clergy to Tijuana to visit one of these camps to see what it's like and how we can help. I know that next weekend we're going to be hosting an interfaith service at 6:30 on Sunday evening, and that there will be trainings for people who want to march down to the border before that. I know that Safe Harbors, a local organization that shelters people, has asked if we can help them find places for asylum seekers, people who are here legally, by the way, to stay. And they've specifically asked if we can help LGBTQ plus asylum seekers because other churches aren't going to want to take those folks. The San Diego Gay Men's Chorus and St. John the Beloved, which meets in our chapel, they've both said that they want to support that work. In fact, I think we've helped to place one asylum seeker already this week. I know that we're going to be asked for space. There's an organization called the New Sanctuary Caravan, and they're bringing in hundreds of volunteers from all over the country to help accompany people through this process. And I know that they're going to need a place to be. You know, it's Advent, and we might wonder if this is the time for us to participate in events like this. And I was reading along in our Advent devotional, which is out on the table in the narthex, and one of the first sentences is this: especially during the Advent season, Christians are not to shy away from the world's pain and despair. On the contrary, it is precisely in the shadows that we are called to light a candle, since that's the place where light can do the most good. Another way to say that is the way one of our congregation members put it to me this week. If someone is getting shot in front of you, you don't stop and think about it. You just help. Friends, it is time to help. It is time to ask who we are and whose we are. Oh, sure, it might be a little inconvenient for us, but I guarantee it's not going to be as inconvenient as leaving absolutely everything you know, traveling across Mexico, waiting at the border, unsure if you're ever going to see your loved ones again, unsure if you're ever going to make it to the United States, and being treated as less than human the whole time. It won't be as inconvenient as that. And I know that we as Christians are called. We as Christians are called to be a light unto the world. We as Christians are called to be sources of hope, of joy, of peace, and of love. We as Christians are called to do something different. We are called to bring light into the shadows. We are called to be there, to see Christ in the face of the stranger. So what do you say, University Christian Church? Will you get up and go? Can we step up? Can we step up, University Christian Church? We'll see. May it be so. Amen.
Can you hear the crying? Can you hear the voice crying in the wilderness?